started with this final session, this closing plenary of the Digital Economy Conference, which is titled "What to Do with the Digital Giants." I mean, what should we do with them? And here with me to discuss this topic, there are two very good scholars who have been working a lot on these issues, on the role of platforms in new economic processes and their kind of political and social implications. To my right, Athina Karatzogianni, who is Associate Professor in Media and Communication at the University of Leicester, and she has done research on the impact of digitization on conflict, activism, and security, and today she will speak mainly about co-production on digital platforms. Yeah. And then to my extreme right, so politically to my extreme left probably, is Srnicek, who is a colleague of mine, a lecturer in digital economy, who is well known for a series of books and articles he's written on digital economy and different topics connected with it. And currently he's writing a book on social reproduction and anti-war politics. So they will have two presentations, but after that we will have a more sort of interviewing kind of discussion and also Q&A, where we will try to focus more on the stated theme of the session. So whoever wants to go first, please go ahead.
I'll go first. How do I get this on there? Again, mic is on, great. So thank you, Paula, for inviting me. Thank you, everybody, for coming out to listen to my talk. What I'm going to talk about today is some ongoing research that I'm working on at the moment. I'm particularly trying to build off of my book on platform capitalism. I'm interested in how platform monopolies are basically changing and developing over the past few years. And I'm particularly interested in the political economy of artificial intelligence. Now, most research so far, when it looks at AI's impact on the economy, has looked at the impact through automation. So this idea that AI is going to take jobs. I'm much more interested in AI's impact on market power. I think this is a much more important aspect than automation. So I'm going to make that case today. Now, platforms characterize the new shift in the economy, the sort of digital economy that we've seen recently. Platforms are, according to my definition, intermediaries and infrastructures. So they are intermediaries between different groups of people, but they're also infrastructures for interaction and development. So let me give a very simple example. Facebook. Facebook is a platform between all these different groups, and we could probably add some more groups to this list as well. So it enables these different groups of people to come together, to interact in various ways, and to somehow get some value from the Facebook platform. Now, Facebook is also an infrastructure. So it allows us as individuals, as users, to be able to produce a public profile. It allows advertisers to be able to build their own little advertising systems on it. App developers can, of course, build their own apps for Facebook, but this is what a platform effectively does. Now, platforms are natural monopolies. So they are natural monopolies in the sense that the very nature of their business model compels them to become monopolistic. It compels a sort of winner-takes-all model. Now, there's three reasons why they become monopolistic. The first of these has to do with what are called network effects. The very basic idea is that the more people who use a platform, the more valuable that platform becomes for everybody else. So a really great example is, again, Facebook. You may not like Mark Zuckerberg at all. You may be annoyed with the Cambridge Analytica controversy. You may be frustrated with all the advertisements on Facebook. But if you're going to join a social media site, it's going to be Facebook because everybody else is already there. That's the power of network effects. A really good example as well is Uber. So this is literally Uber's strategy written on the back of a napkin. So when they were first designing their business, this is how they managed to get some money, by outlining this strategy on the back of a napkin. So this is network effects for Uber. The more drivers you get means the more geographical coverage and saturation you have in a city. That means faster pickups for users, which leads to more demand. But it also means less driver downtime. So you get lower prices, which then leads to more demand. All of that leads to more drivers. So it's a sort of virtuous cycle here that's going on within Uber's business model, and this is what compels them to constantly grow. Now, the second reason why platforms become monopolistic is data. So they are able to build and extract a huge amount of data by the very nature of the business model. So platforms, by positioning themselves between different groups, are able to record and extract all of that data about those interactions. If you think about a traditional business, what would happen is you would produce a good, produce a service, sell it to a customer, and then that would be the extent of the knowledge you might have about the data. A platform is different. People are constantly interacting with it, constantly coming back to it. You get a huge amount of data, and that allows you to build a competitive advantage against other companies. Now, a third reason for monopolistic tendencies is pathdependency. So once a platform starts to become dominant, all those different groups on a platform start orienting their behaviors towards that platform. Now, a really good example of this is media companies who have pivoted towards Facebook's video. They thought Facebook video was going to be the future of the news feed, is going to be the future of news, and companies were laying off entire sections of their media organization to pivot towards Facebook video. Now that means those media companies have an entrenched interest that Facebook becomes dominant and remains dominant. Likewise, us as users, we put all this time and effort into curating our profiles. We've got histories of messages on Facebook. We have an entrenched interest in Facebook continuing on. We might be a little bit disappointed if it suddenly disappeared tomorrow. So that's pathdependency. The more users it gets, the more people are interested in continuing that business. Now, primarily what we've seen so far is that platforms are developing in different sectors. They're gaining monopolies in those sectors. So we can think about Google and search, Amazon and e-commerce, Facebook and social media. And that's the way platforms have developed so far. The problem is AI changes this. So AI is now becoming the focus of all of these top-tier platforms. So this is a quote from last year from Google's CEO. In the long run, we're evolving in computing from a mobile-first to an AI-first world. So Google now presents itself not as a search engine company, but as an AI-first company. Just in March of this year, Microsoft reorganized its entire business to focus on AI and cloud computing. And just last week, Google renamed its Google Research section to Google AI. So all of these companies are now turning towards AI as their dominant framework. So that means if once we had these silos, we now have something more like this, where all of these companies are now becoming artificial intelligence companies. So we're starting to see convergence of all these major platforms. And I should emphasize, this is not just in the Western world, this is also in the Chinese ecosystem as well. Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, they're all now becoming AI companies explicitly as well. So they're increasingly competing with each other for AI. Now, why have they all moved into this field? Simple answer, money. It's a very profitable area. And the reason why is that AI is a general purpose technology. This means it's not just limited to one economic sector, but it's something which can be used across the entire economy. So it's something which every business is going to come to use. We can see already numerous tasks that firms do every single day. They're replaceable or improvable by AI right now. So for instance, determining whether suspicious activity with a credit card, determining whether or not that's fraud, that can be improved by AI. Recommending products to buy, predicting what social media posts you most want to see, All of these things are replaceable or improvable by artificial intelligence. But there's also a whole series of tasks which aren't obviously replaceable by AI, but they have huge economic impacts as we translate them into AI replaceable tasks. Best example of this is self-driving cars. So self-driving cars, it was thought that we would have to program in all these if-then statements about what happens in certain contexts when a robot car is driving down the street. It turns out we can translate the problem of self-driving cars into something which is amenable to machine learning. And this is why we've seen massive advances in the last 10 years. We've translated this problem into something which is adaptable to AI. Now the end result is that AI is already being used across the economy, and it's only going to be being used more and more. Now the problem for most companies is that AI is very difficult and expensive. So to get the talent and all the necessary equipment to do AI in your business is incredibly expensive and incredibly complicated. So what's happening is that we started to see cloud-based AI services from all these major platforms providing AI services to companies that can rent it out. Now cloud computing is an absolutely huge market. It made around $260 billion in 2017. It's estimated to go up to $411 billion by 2020. And there's estimates from Google that this may double once AI gets into cloud computing. There's currently a US military contract out tendering a proposal for a $10 billion 10-year contract. Amazon is likely to get it, but Google and Microsoft would also love to. And Amazon, as we see, dominates this market right now. Depending on the figures, it's around 40% for Amazon, but Microsoft and Google are both catching up in cloud computing as well. Now, I think one really interesting statistic about the importance of cloud computing to these companies is that Amazon Web Services is Amazon's profit leader. So we like to think about Amazon as being an e-commerce company. Increasingly, their cloud computing sector is what's generating all of their profit. It's what's generating the income which allows them to do everything else. So, from a political economy perspective, the major problem is that cloud AI exacerbates platform tendencies towards monopolization. So AI is fundamentally a centralizing technology. And basically the idea here is that the technological requirements to do contemporary AI, they induce a strong tendency towards centralization and concentration of capital. And why is this the case? It's because AI involves, or contemporary AI involves machine learning. So contemporary AI feeds off of data. You throw all this data, you train algorithms, and then you get these algorithms which can do magical things. So this approach to AI requires three things which cloud platforms are in the best position to benefit from. First, of course, is the access to huge amounts of data. So data is the key proprietary resource from all of these platform companies. Companies have open sourced hardware design, they've open sourced AI research, they've open sourced AI frameworks. They don't open source data. Data is the proprietary resource that no matter how open Google or any of these other companies gets, they don't give away their data because it is the key resource for contemporary AI. Now Chinese companies presently are also assisted by the government giving them access to data. And I think there's going to be very strong competitive pressures for the American government, for the European governments, for all these other governments to also give data to AI platforms, to give them a competitive advantage. Now, the second requirement of artificial intelligence today is computing power. So to train algorithms, you need brute computational force to do that. You need to run these GPUs over and over and over again to get these algorithms trained. You also need computational resources to scale things. So to give one example here, if you have a real-time translation app, if you want to be able to do that for millions of people around the world, that requires an immense amount of computational power. And of course, all of this computational power requires a lot of capital. It requires a lot of money. So it would help if your company has, say, a cloud computing division which already has a ton of hardware. So I think cloud computing and AI are actually symbiotic. They require each other. So platform companies with cloud services are at an advantage here. What we're seeing is that companies are now fighting for competitive advantage in the hardware sector. So this is a list of 19 companies around the world which are currently developing chips specifically for deep learning, for AI as it's done today. So you see there's a lot of US, but you'll also notice there's a lot of Chinese companies. So China's investing a huge amount of money right now into its own chip manufacturers, chip designers, in order to get their own domestic capacities. You can see as well that Facebook, Google, all of these companies are also trying to develop their own to get a comparative advantage. Google's chip has already saved them millions, if not billions of dollars on energy costs. They run it in their data servers, and it allows them to save a huge amount of money on energy costs. So if data and compute are two resources for contemporary AI, the third one is talent. You need individuals who know how to do this stuff. And talent is at incredibly short supply at the moment. So AI researchers are in huge demand, and they can command huge salaries as well. So even between Google and Facebook and all these companies, they are fighting and competing to pay enough money to get these people to come work for them. So that means companies with the cash to spend on this talent are the ones who are winning out. A really good example of this, and this story is literally from 2 days ago. This is basically the massive brain drain that we see from academia to the corporate sector, because there's no way that academia can pay a sufficient amount to keep talent working in universities. So all of these requirements, these technical requirements of doing AI today, data, compute, and talent, they benefit large platform companies, and particularly large platform cloud companies. Now what we've seen is that these companies are also getting heavily involved in mergers and acquisitions. They're buying up other companies and concentrating more capital underneath their own wings. So we have record levels of mergers and acquisitions across the world, and the technology sector, as we can see here, is the one that's leading it. If we look just at Google, this is Google acquisitions between 2010 and 2016 at a quarterly period. We can see that at certain points in time, Google has been buying a new company every week. So they are investing a huge amount and growing larger and larger and larger, concentrating capital under their wings. If we zoom down just to AI, we see that AI startup acquisitions have been increasing a huge amount. They're up 44% in 2017, and that'll probably increase a huge amount this year as well. And there's a nice little diagram here of AI acquisitions by company. Google is the one that has bought the most AI startups. Apple is the second most, with Facebook and Amazon just behind as well. So what we see here is that even small-time AI competitors are just being bought up by the large monopolies. They are concentrating more and more under them. Now, on top of all this, as if this wasn't bad enough, AI has its own positive feedback loop. So if we start from the top, if you get more data, compute, and talent, you're going to have better AI. Better AI is going to lead to better services and products. Better services and products are going to lead to more users. That'll lead to more resources, computer resources, data, and talent. So you get a virtuous cycle going on here, where at a certain stage, just nobody can compete with the top AI companies. So we're seeing AI being consolidated amongst a handful of companies, and increasingly they're competing against each other. So I think this age where platforms were relatively segmented in different industries, I think that's starting to disappear now, and they're starting to compete against each other. But all is not lost. And I think AI's future does remain somewhat open. So I want to conclude by looking at some counter tendencies towards all of this. The first counter tendency is that we can create synthetic data. So we don't just need real data from the world, from users. Instead, what a lot of AI startups are starting to do now is create their own data. So an example on the right-hand side here, this is from a Berlin startup that wanted to do sort of Snapchat filters for human faces and body parts. So they couldn't get access to a huge amount of images, moving images of humans. It was way too costly to do that. So they synthetically created that data and then trained their algorithms on the basis of that. So there is a possibility that we can start to create our own data that isn't necessarily drawn from the real world. Likewise, more and more AI is focused on synthetic environments. A really good example is a number of companies are now looking at placing artificial agents within game environments and letting them learn from that. So again, you don't need real-world data here. You've got a little environment that you can let AIs run around in and learn their sort of behaviors from that. Now, one problem is that synthetic data remains bound to the model you use to generate that data. So we'll never have a novelty emerge from this that isn't already based within StarCraft's environment. Likewise, a model that's producing human hands and stuff like that is never going to produce a novelty. So there are limits to synthetic data. Now, a second counter tendency is algorithms. And somewhat surprisingly, given the sort of very capitalist nature of this stuff, most AI research is open and public. It's a part of the culture that this stuff be made open. There's again a recent news story from 2 weeks ago. Nature wanted to put out a machine learning journal, but it was going to be closed access. And basically AI researchers went into a massive uproar and said that they're going to boycott the journal until it becomes open access and available to everybody. So a lot of the algorithmic research is actually open access. So that helps competitors. There is a possibility there of fighting against the monopolies. But I think more strikingly it's possible that we might develop new ways of doing AI that aren't as heavily reliant upon data or computing power. So there's a number of firms which are working on this at the moment. There's not been a lot of success yet, but it is still a possibility, a theoretical possibility. There's also evidence that startups can compete against the monopolies. A really good example here is a benchmark challenge that was recently run. They had companies around the world use their AI models to get to an accuracy of 94% or greater on a particular image set. And what we see here is that the very top one there, Fastai, and the third one is also Fastai, we're able to train to a 94% accuracy at a much cheaper rate than competitors like Google or anybody else. Not only could they do it cheaper, this one shows that they also did it faster. So Fastai is a low-budget, non-profit company, doesn't have a lot of access to a ton of resources, doesn't have a lot of money or anything, but is still managing to compete on a very basic algorithmic test against Google and these monopolies. Now, in most cases, the monopolies did win, but I think this does show that it's possible. We also have another way to fight against monopolies and the centralizing of AI is through blockchain. Now, these are much more speculative at the moment. This is one called Ocean Protocol, which is basically an attempt to build some of the components you might need for a decentralized blockchain-based artificial intelligence. Another one is Morpheo, which actually has some funding support from the French government. And it's an attempt to build a compute economy. So rather than having to rely upon Google Cloud to get your computing resources, you would have this sort of decentralized compute economy where you could get the resources you need to do AI without it being centrally owned. So there are blockchain initiatives which are trying to decentralize AI right now. Now, lastly, we could think about public ownership as a way to take the centralization tendencies of AI and turn it at least towards the public benefit rather than it being owned by private corporations. Now this seems somewhat outlandish, but actually we already see inklings of it in a number of countries. So Japan is recently completed what they call their AI bridging cloud infrastructure. So this is basically a supercomputer designed to enable researchers in Japan to get access to all the AI resources that they might need. So Japan's already done this. France, about a month ago, released their AI strategy document. Hidden within it is the proposal to build a supercomputer for AI research there as well. So we already see a number of countries around the world saying, we need this hardware, we need cloud computing, we need AI compute resources. Maybe we should publicly produce them and own them. So public ownership of AI might be another way to think about using the centralization of AI to our benefit. So in summary, I think these are all of the different sort of forces that are pulling artificial intelligence in different directions right now. There's strong tendencies towards centralization within AI, but I don't think that that's the only story that's going on here. And that we should also pay attention to some of these more minor stories that might decentralize AI in different ways. Now I think all of this becomes even more significant as these companies move into increasingly important parts of the economy. So advertising, which most of these companies are based off to some degree, doesn't make actually that much revenue. But what does make a lot of revenue is healthcare, is energy, is transportation. All of these companies are now using AI in those sectors of the economy, and they're going to come to dominate it unless we start thinking about how can we modify this. And I think the worst thing that we could do is to just take Google at their word that they won't be evil. Thank you.
What to do with the giants, what to do with the gig economy, and so on. So I'm analyzing some of these discourses and ideological progression coming out of that. I just wanted to start with this, and then I'm going to move rather faster. But I want to talk about Carmen here talking about one of the first networks, well, in 1994 already, and she says her experience of it, I began to see I have commodified myself, creating my ideas such as a means of production for the corporation, etc. I sold my soul the potential, I derived no profit. And that is one of the most, the first virtual community in 1985, the world community, and that is a quote from 1994. So it's not that we're waking up to the problems that we have at the moment. They have been there for a long time. And in fact, some of my work that is relevant to what we're discussing here I was looking at 2 decades of digital activism, the middle, the fairground-based monograph. We did some work on with other colleagues on looking at gender and migration and the reproduction of organizations in digital networks, and then the digital culture and sort of bringing effect into the discussion of digital cultures before that. Now, I started my thesis were actually looking at how we can bring together to theorize cyber conflicts between groups when they're online. And some of the elements I was looking at is bringing social theory, social mobilization into it. Then I was bringing what do we do when we have ethnic and religious type of conflicts? For example, Israelis attacking Pakistanis, Israelis attacking Palestinians, Indians attacking Pakistanis, and so on. And then like what do we do with how we have a medium? So that was like the beginning of looking at some kind of what happens when people have what kind of elements of theory and understanding to understand an online conflict. Now, I'm trying to set sort of the talk very quickly. The problems we have with digital politics, and many people in this room that I know of have grappled with these problems, is how do you actually, what it means to be engaged politically online. Does it result in a long sustained political participation or not? There's the echo chamber effect, the digital divide, who is online and who is not. How does the state actually deal with movements and their use of ICTs and so on? Does it basically lead to democratic societies? These are basic political questions we have about this. And in fact, when we have AI, we'll have many more of these. It's just we're going to communicate with the robot constantly for us because we have given up. So other questions include, this is just self-expression, it doesn't lead to sustainable political action, it just promotes individualized politics. It actually, people have made, the argument is disruptive of democratic action. We have that it actually does an impact on political engagement and so on. People censor themselves all the time. They don't have meaningful interactions online and so on. Now, I want to bring an example of an activist in Barcelona that I interviewed, who is saying here, well, we know there's all these problems, we know there's surveillance, we know we're engaging in civil association, well, we are on networks that are there to do enterprise association, but this is where the new square is, this is where it happens, and we have to be there, although we're mindful, to protect ourselves using Tor and so on and so forth. We don't have to be dogmatic, because a lot of the left was saying, well, these platforms are evil, we should just use alternative platforms and so on. So it's saying, well, we have to engage with this, because this is where the new public sphere, the new digital square is, so to speak, right? So some effort that we did to actually start and understand like a sketch of how sort of different orders of descent and the root orders of descent actually were trying the different levels of agency and structure, what were the dominant agents, in what kind of labor processes, and we did some kind of work in that respect of bringing this together, of how these movements actually fight capitalism as a social code, to use the terminology by Baudrillard, and what type of different ideas we can have there. For example, you have a dominant that is the human motivation, and then you have intentionality in organizations, and you have distributed agency at the level of the post-national rhizomatic type of stuff. So what Nick was talking about would fall into the distributed assemblage, techno-social, rhizomatic manipulation, extension, and so on. So the political atmosphere, meanwhile, is what is it? We have a monopoly of digital planning, and we have secret communication between government and corporate elites, and sometimes actually NGOs, because they get funded by governments and corporations. We have enterprise association policies and politics basically happening. We have data acquisition and so on. So that's the political atmosphere of where we are, and then we have the economic atmosphere, right? And I'm saying atmosphere not because of fluffy, it's just like sort of trying to give sort of the infrastructure and the ideology, actually, the superstructure and the structure, actually, they're one thing at the moment. They're not separate anymore. And they directly, because of the acceleration of how we can do change and how we can program, for example, as Nick was saying, AI to do it, they actually are becoming one thing that is completely integrated. And Nikos took this diagram from his new book, Endological. He's actually showing what is happening there in terms of these digital giants that we're here to discuss today. So that's the economic atmosphere at the moment. They are in the top 10 economies in the world. This is what these infrastructures are there. Now, what about platforms, and what would be interesting to ask about platforms and research we did with Jacob Matthews at Paris State University? We actually started to ask, okay, is this intermediation platforms contribute to legitimizing capitalism, or is some of them are hoping to redesign these processes to basically have less exploitation of digital labor and so on? Are they used, the sort of common discourses that they're everywhere, are they used like the common good in what economies of worth? Is it a new way to say, well, if we use more ethical terms, more like commons this and commons that, are we going to have platforms that are more fair, or are they a reiteration, basically, of another iteration of capitalism? Some questions. So what I want to do very quickly, after I've set up sort of a little platform from what to launch, what I want to say is talk about what sets of data sources I've been using, and do some actually ideological production analysis of actors such as Uber, Airbnb, and the Competition Authority in Barcelona, and also look at some of the discourses of commons and platform cooperativism discourses, and offer some concluding thoughts, because I think these strands are pretending, or like not pretending, like offering some kind of solutions also to what to do with platform capitalism, what to do with the problems of giants and so on. So there is a lot of research, and we've been very lucky to have it. The scholarship in this field in the last 20 years has been phenomenal. I think to actually look at these questions, you have to have this critical political economy and platformization, starting from Lauder, Lexington, and so on, and then you have digital activism scholarship that goes back from Rainbow all the way to Latin Shape, wonderful work, recent work that I've read, and all these people that you have been seeing, listening to, I'm sure, in talks all over the world. And then you have this critical analysis of cultural industries, and here Alessandro's work has been influential for me. Also, sort of the French cultural industries people I've been working with in Paris have been very influential. Now, in terms of the attention economy, again, you have another strand there, and the digital labor question, the usual suspects. Then you have the sharing economy, crowd gig work people, Greg Medal, Magriam at the Oxford Institute, De Stefano and Marcellian, and these discourses that actually track gig work and the crowd work in the global south as well. So there is like wonderful scholarship, and I think that in many respects we do need all these scholarship cross-fertilized to be able to understand some of the questions of what we're trying to grapple with in terms of what do you do with these platform capitalists, what do you do with the sharing economy, exploitation, what do you do, okay? So the film we did with Jacob Matthews included many trips in many events like Procomuts in Barcelona, Transmediale, we share P2P value in the Nuit Debout, and then in Barcelona in Tebeus, protests, and then we are organized quite a few events to get scholars to talk about this. And some of the activists we interviewed diverse actors, so it wasn't just digital activists or the surveillance activists or platform cooperatives or consultants. We also tried to actually ask the Uber Airbnb people what they thought they were doing in terms of the public policy people and competition authorities, particularly in Barcelona. Now, what the themes of the interviews were is how did these people, these actors, understood their role in their organization, what forms of labor they were actually engaged in, and how did they reflect on particular terms, what kind of terms they were using, the sharing, the collaborative, alternative, and so on, and what were their ideological inclinations when they were using these terms. And some of the research questions we had in relation to what kind of relational productions are they operating in, do they differ from predominant models, for instance, how do they contribute to building and agitating and constructing and producing more discourses about the work they're doing, how do they justify themselves and reflect themselves in these processes, how do they actually use this ethical, politically radical, and so on, discourses to legitimize their operations, or they actually redesigning or having a vision that redesigns the labor process, and how are they envisaging that, exactly how do they do it in their work, how do they interact, the participants view their work, and within their organization what they're doing. So some of the questions. Now, very quickly, I want to talk about a few of these actors and what they were saying. So here we have the Uber public policy spokesperson, and we're asking them, there is a clear political pressure against you, and he says yes, especially while you have a city with a lot of demand, with, they're not, because of regulation we can't operate here and so on. We're asking what is your response to it, and so on. And he basically arrives in this thing that I thought it was disturbing when he says the only way to make sure something is going to change is to get a lot of people into it. And this goes back to, you get a lot of people on the network and so on, so we get enough people to use it. They won't mind because look, they're using Facebook, right? And all these scandals are happening, no one is living it. So get enough people into it and it's gonna be okay. Then you have the big person, and he's saying it's going to evolve into a world of experiences. That's where we're going with this. So this is, if you think about the notion of hypercapitalism, where you have the idea of the commodification of everything. Everything becomes an experience. We can sell you, commodify, put it in materially, culturally, like everything is sort of this hypercapitalism scenario. And what he's saying here is that we don't mind, if Adam, for example, wants to fund these cooperatives and these new actors, because we are compatible with them. And in terms of public funding, he says, I think it's legitimate. I'm comfortable with the policy as a whole. I'm super happy to be working with these people and so on. And then we interviewed the Catalan Competition Authority, and this is where I'm saying, so the person say, person one, our position is free competition. We will also consider market fairness and externalities. We don't understand regulation as a justification. And so we're pressing him and say, so you defend free competition. So it's like Adam Smith, I'm saying. And he says, well, the better it is. Prices, are lower. We have better quality information. And I'm saying, but this is already, you start from this sort of ideological position of what we're talking about. And the person says, yes, that's what we're here for to do. This is the watchdog for the shared economy in Catalonia. Now, the other thing is when you ask about sometimes too ideological. So there can be public policy person is saying this, sometimes it's too ideological. So it says, unless we are the pro-corporate movement or the corporate movement, we don't exist, people don't want to listen to anything about it, it becomes too ideological, then we can't discuss things because everything is confused, there are elections, it takes ages to do anything, and so on. Then some sort of analysis of people talking about the commons, that was particularly as one of the strands moving on to the commons. You have the Goto person here, and she's saying, if you commonize, you are preventing privatization because it's for the community. So this is a commons-oriented idea that proposed in Barcelona. You have a tool that could produce change in the democratic field and so on. And then you have another person that has used the Goto platform to crowdfund a documentary on a project, and he's Greek, and he's saying, well, if you have, in the context of the Greek rights and capital controls, you have, this platform has actually reached its limits because we cannot actually do or organize this anymore because of the capital controls. So you have these platforms that are, ethical or have these limits. And then he's talking also about the linguistics of this and the repertoire that they find that some of the commons and the ethical, and the logical vocabulary is actually copy-pasted into more corporate, artistic endeavors, and he's referring to specific, very strong cultural institute in Athens, corporate, a foundation that is funded by corporate capital. Another situation of how people were talking about commons in Paris, for instance, when we did interviews, and it was the idea of not privatizing, but because they were accused of taking over a public, that they were there and they were taking over the space, and that they were taking it over into this public domain. And this activist is saying that basically what's going on is we commonize the space. Okay, so he's talking about that, but then we're asking about the spectrum of the commons and what different commons are. He says that we have to maintain this spectrum and not to be too rigid about it. And in Paris, again, in the same period, we're talking to this open food network person. There were people here talking about the open food network today. And again, you have an explanation of the commons that is about the open source code. We build a democratic governance entity, so it's focusing on how the platform works, basically what it's trying to do. Now, what is going on with some of these commons kind of discourses? You have a spectrum that is a bit confused about what is commons. So people talking about commons as a source of keeping tradition together. In Barcelona, for example, people talk about it like that. People talk about commons as commons licenses. People talk about it in sort of collaborativeness in research, for example. It is about the software that is common. So you have like this conflicting ideological elements inside the spectrum of the commons that basically you don't seem to have actually attempts to redesign anything or exist corporate intermediaries by actually making the commons happen, so to speak. Now, an interesting case here in that respect is this Catalan activist that has been involved with cooperativists for a very long period of time, with different types and so on. And he says that we can't have, just traditional cooperatives becoming digital. What you have there is like an ecosystem where you have the connection of all these cooperatives together. And he's saying a handful of cooperatives cannot fight in the capital society. So it has to be part of an ecosystem. But what is interesting here, at the same time, is he's saying transform the form of capitalism rather than so how do you transform the form of capitalism, but you still have some form of capitalism in terms of the cooperative kind of ecosystem. And here, I think it's interesting. There's somebody at Uyshare actually saying, well, when I got the cooperative movement, I'm the capitalist. When I'm the Uyshare movement, I'm a little bit the cooperativist. So you see, like people in the revolving doors, like Antonio Casilli would actually say, you have these revolving doors where you're a bit here, you're like that, a bit here, you're like that, and then you have sort of this confusion, of basically what this cooperativism, cooperativism is or it can be, and another in their spectrum where now recently the commons have entered the spectrum of the platform capitalism as well. You have like this merge and amalgam of spectrum or ideological spectrum there. No, so what we're actually trying to understand is that do you have in these discourses, how do they envisage, what do you do about these platforms? And these platform managers, in some situations we're talking about, we need to connect the people, get people into it, make them belong anywhere. So you have like this very bizarre idea where you have this ecosystem, this representation of ecosystem, a crowdsourced ecosystem, and you have this autonomous intermediation governance system, supposedly like redesign labor processes, but actually what is this happening in reality, and are they just agitating about this, or what is actually happening? Are more autonomous players able to affect some change in the structure? what exactly is it happening. And then you have this discourse about these more humane organizations that we are going to democratize, offer people the opportunity to be, in these organizations that are more faithful to people and engaged, and but they also can also be profitable. So you have these ideas happening. People like the Airbnb guys, it's uncomfortable to work with these other people. We can make all money together. This kind of scenario. So some of the ideas we're setting out to explore is we didn't actually arrive into sort of definitive answers, I guess. So we were able to, for example, validate this hypothesis that you have more effectivity when you have like discourses clinging on to dominant forms, that the ones that cling on and they're more open to the mainstream dominant form of capitalism are more effective and more successful. So we couldn't actually validate this with an answer, but what materialized was that this ideological production, okay, is very important, and it has an effect in how people are designing labor processes, how people are reacting to what is happening, how do they persuade themselves to create justification, registers, and motivation for the work they're doing. So the other thing that we found is that we have a great imprecision and confusion of the ideological forms that are produced, and then none of the people we interviewed had coherent plans like on actually how do you get these ideological elements of what you're saying and justifications become a reality. So that was another idea. So the little bit platform cooperative is a little bit capitalism is a bit like that. And then you have this dependency on the apparatus and platforms. So in all this, what I think I found very interesting, and it hit me at some point that how is it that people are not conscious of it's like the shoe situation. Like I sold my soul for a shoe. Like is this some form of false consciousness that people are persuading themselves to keep producing, or they're in this precarious position so they have no alternative, or they're actually believing in what is going on. So this is the idea, and I think in that respect, the idea about this intermediary class and counter class might be useful in explaining some of what is going on. Thank you very much.
All right, so we have some time now for discussion and questions. I mean, I remember one of the two organizers of the program, I remember when the drinks were supposed to start. If anybody has a program at hand, I mean, I think it's 6:30, so I think we have now half an hour or 40 minutes for some discussion. I'd start that with perhaps a kind of short response. I mean, what I found quite interesting in both talks is seeing how the scenario of the economy has changed, the digital economy, and also kind of the discourses, an assumption associated with it in a way that could be summed up with a kind of idea of a return of the molar vis-a-vis the molecular. Like this famous binary position of Deleuze and Guattari, where they say basically that society has a molar or mass logic to it, or a more molecular and network-like, right? I mean, the initial imaginary of the digital economy was very much imaginary of radical decentralization, was basically this very lofty and edifying discourse of an internet that is going to basically liberate our creative energies and allow us to self-organize. We may call it the imaginary of the digital corner shop or the digital watchmaker, which actually was tying in a lot with a certain anarchist discourse, Bakunin and the Jura Federation, in the idea that we would all be basically like watchmakers in Jura or in Switzerland, by producing our small things and then be able to sell it on the market and therefore act as independent producers, or Kropotkin's imaginary of the workshop vis-a-vis the factory, right? Basically, we were heading towards world where not only small is beautiful, but also small is viable in a way, right? Where we would all be there producing our stuff, it would be fun, we would be able to sell it, right? And we would be basically empowered, autonomous, all these basically discourse of autonomy. Well, actually what we find there is, and you could actually see that a lot in Nick's talk, is that that is not the case. Actually, perhaps we are heading back, we're moving back towards kind of second Gilded Age, right? It very much looks like a situation between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, as these huge trusts were emerging. That is why, I think possibly it's the only reason why that metaphor, data is the new oil, makes some sense, in that, you know, the situation we have now resembles the situation of trusts and oil trusts, particularly back then. And it's a situation indeed where you have very strong power laws, namely winner takes all situation, as Nick was putting it, a situation where no matter how hard you try, no matter how inventive or creative you are, I mean, the cure is very steep, I mean, competition is very fierce. Unless you get in at the right time, you are basically condemned to be absorbed by one of these giants. There is basically indeed a monopolistic tendency where either you are one of the seven sisters, as they were called back in the days, with oil companies, or you are not, right? There's no space for you to be a small watchmaker of the Jura Federation, digital watchmaker. And that connects then to Athina's talk, where you also see how, indeed, I mean, perhaps we shouldn't talk about false consciousness. I mean, Podemos activists interestingly put it in a talk that I witnessed, there is no such a thing as false consciousness. It's a kind of false concept as such. But say, at least this very, the fact that there is indeed an hegemony of this discourse of digital economy to the point that even activists basically absorb it and believe that that kind of commons idea is actually something radical and alternative, well, perhaps that is not the case, right? And that leads me basically to a question that is, I mean, these forms of platform cooperativism that you, Athina, have studied, and that now are a very kind of thriving phenomenon that is growing. We also had a paper in this conference discussing that. I mean, to what extent are they a viable alternative? I mean, not just an ethical and therefore legitimate alternative, but also a viable alternative, a politically viable alternative. Because, I mean, to me here, and really here I'm kind of priming the title of the session, I mean, what do we do with digital giants? I mean, it is clear at this point in time that there is a problem, right? I mean, everybody is aware of that, and even from the political class, it is in a way coming to that realization that it is not really okay to be in an economy where you have these huge companies that control so much of the economy with huge amounts of money stuck in fiscal havens, that basically that is not something that can be sustained in the long term, even from a capitalistic perspective, right? So there, what is the alternative that should be pursued? I mean, one may be the kind of platform cooperativism that Athina was describing, namely, let's create our own digital companies owned by producers and users, extending the cooperative model and translating it into the digital age. Another one may be basically a very kind of, say, traditional liberal measure, namely, let's break the trusts, right? So let's force Google, Facebook, right, to sell part of their operations, right, in order to allow more competition in the market. That's the sort of traditional or liberal, moderate policy solution to monopolistic situation, or oligopolistic, more properly said. in this case. And then there is the third alternative, that is socialization or nationalization. So namely, the only way to go about this is for the state to basically buy Google or buy Facebook, or perhaps create a service provider, a utility company, digital utility company that substitutes Facebook or Google, or at least say part of the activity of these companies in a given territorial area, be it regional, national, or continental. I mean, perhaps as your talks have given us kind of food for thought on these, also kind of with empirical evidence, we perhaps be interested to see what you think, which one, say, of these strategies to deal with this second Gilded Age is the one that should be pursued. Easy peasy, isn't it?
Tiny questions. So you mentioned the oil trust in the 19th century, and I think that's a really sort of apt similarity. But I think actually it's a bit worse than it was back then. The core reason being that AI is this general purpose technology, whereas oil was not something that every company needed to have direct access to. A lot of companies, most companies in the economy, aren't directly reliant upon oil. But AI is something which every company is directly reliant upon. So I think these AI companies, these AI monopolies, are going to have even more power than what the oil companies once did. Now I think in terms of this question about what should be done, I think you're absolutely right. The three sort of possibilities that you set out. So platform cooperative. The problem I see with that, which was mentioned by one of the activists, which is platforms operate in a capitalist market. You still face all the pressures of competition, you still have to make profit. And this drives platforms inevitably to do traditional capitalist things. So treat workers terribly, all sorts of things. So I don't think platforms fundamentally change the social relationships in any significant way. They're fundamentally compatible with capitalism. They've not been a threat to capitalism. You can imagine sort of a point at which they would become sufficiently scaled to be a threat to capitalism, but there's never been anything close to that yet. The other option, which is really popular in America right now, the Democrats are sort of picking up on it, which is the antitrust option. Of course, antitrust is the ultimate capitalist sort of solution, which is just competition is great, and therefore we just want more competition. That's not a socialist answer in any way. So I think we're left with this third option, socialization. And I think it's a possibility, but I think it poses other challenges that we don't necessarily have answers to at the moment. So the territoriality question is, I think, a really crucial one. Something like Facebook, Amazon, Google, they are increasingly fundamentally global companies. How do you square that with, say, national ownership? Or what would it mean to have global ownership of these things? Likewise with security issues, so how do you prevent governments from just spying on any sort of nationally owned platform? And I think that's all possible, but it does pose really incredibly difficult challenges to that as a sort of easy answer. So I'm inclined towards that as an answer, but recognizing there's a ton of work to be done towards it.
Okay, so I don't know, the three solutions, I think they lack imagination, because if you think about the history of the digital economy and all these emphasis on these companies, I mean, within 5 years, we might be in a totally different landscape, where they are self-disrupting themselves, merging, breaking up as a new competitor, new kid on the block. I mean, so basically you can't just say, oh, we'll take Facebook and make it into a public thing and things are going to be okay, right? So, saying, well, we can continue on these business models we have now, which are based on exploitation, you bring the product, all the analysis that anybody from Fastai and onwards has always done, Nick Graham, everybody has done for the last 30 years. But if we make it a public day, we're going to save the day. I think is because the world is distracted by a situation where you are so alienated that it is okay to be selling your soul for a shoe. And I think this is you're too comfortable and complicit in where you are and what you have to give up to be continuing to engage and have the benefits of being on social networks and sociality online, and then later on with the AI and so on. So actually I was inspired thinking about these solutions we're discussing lack imagination because of your presentation. Because in your presentations you have this how AI might actually change the whole game altogether and new kind of actors coming in and disrupting the previous ones. So actually you have a solution that is ecologically reasonable and sustainable. There is no scaling up to mimic and reiterate and just make it public exploitation. Just make it a government and public is going to be okay. So this is how I'm reacting to the solutions.
All right, so perhaps to continue the conversation, we'll take some questions from the public. I'll take 3 at a time. We have the mic there, please.
Thank you. Thank you. 2 really stimulating different viewpoints, and then a sort of typology of answers offered. I was thinking maybe we need to think longer back and bigger picture than the oil barons or the railroads, but in terms of solutions to the problems that capitalism brings and where the solutions come from. If we go back to sort of the early stages of globalization, or the slave trade, or the destruction of the commons through industrialization, I can't see that a solution would come at the level of individual players, software developers and firms, nor of political activists, or in this globalized world of a nation-state solution. I think we might learn something if we looked at the ecological movement, where a global problem that transcends national boundaries or the interests of corporations, and that I guess something like the equivalent of the Kyoto or the Paris agreements, where multilateral agencies expressed concern at the danger that the increasing problems of platforms, power platforms and AI could be addressed not at the national level, not at firms being nationalised, but at regulation that transcends national boundaries.
Perhaps. I mean, I'll comment on that while you go for the other speaker. I mean, but then to me there is also perhaps a problem that we assume too much that globalization is inevitable, because then you have countries like Russia that basically has its own social networks, or China that has its own social networks, right? And then, right, those are usually held to be the kind of authoritarian systems. But I'm not sure whether, going back to the question of territoriality that Nick was raising there, whether it is inevitable that we are, for everything in a global system, whether you may not have, say, regional or national services, at least in certain areas. Just adding to that.
So I'm interested in what the panelists think about a radical alternative where AIs essentially become emancipated themselves. And we have this world of AIs, or complexes of AIs, that operate under their own autonomy without human ownership. Especially if this takes place on a distributed platform like a blockchain, where you don't have a single point of failure where you can just pull the plug. And I'm curious if you think that is a possibility, and if so, what are the implications?
Sure. Maybe on the first question. I think in an ideal world, a multilateral solution would be fantastic. I don't think it's all that possible, though. And I think you raised the question of the environmental agreements as an example. But of course, they've done very little to actually slow climate change, unfortunately. And I think what we're seeing is, particularly with the rise of China and Trump in power, is more and more nationalistic tensions. We don't see cooperation between countries. We see Europe sort of splintering apart. We see one of my favorite little stories from Trump was, but a couple months ago, there was a news story that went out that he wanted to nationalize the 5G network. And I thought, wow, this sounds great. You sort of read into it, you realize the only thing he's more terrified of than communism is China. He was worried about Chinese security, and he didn't want Chinese companies getting into America's 5G, so he thought, I'll nationalize it and do a socialist thing to block off China. So I think a sort of multilateral agreement in the current conditions is virtually impossible. I think China is spending $150 billion over the next 13 years. They're fully invested in beating America at it. And America, just yesterday actually, announced Trump is going to start a task force on AI. So they're fighting against it as well. On the emancipated AI's idea, I think this really comes down to the question of what autonomy means. And I think the sort of autonomy that we have with AIs today is really extremely limited. You can think of a sort of strong AI scenario where you've got AIs that are autonomous in the same sense that humans are. I don't think that's technologically feasible for maybe a century. I think it's extremely far off, if it's even possible. I think the more sort of worrying case, though, is AIs which are limited autonomous. But what happens when we set them loose and something goes wrong? Who's responsible? As a part of the issue with European regulations at the moment, there's this idea of giving robots rights. And part of it is a reason to delegate responsibility from the companies who create these algorithms to delegate responsibility to the algorithms themselves. That's highly problematic. We should be blaming companies for their algorithms going wrong rather than blaming the algorithms.
Yeah, I'm more interested in this AI question, the emancipation and the radical alternative. I think, and I disagree that you can't have this autonomy, because if you're going to send something in outer space somewhere, it has to have the conditions algorithmically to survive on its own and not, break down. So you could have strong autonomy actually already. You have strong autonomy there because it has to keep going to survive in a hostile environment. So this kind of thing is happening right now. But what I was thinking in the case that you're describing in that scenario, what you might have is a complete reversal of how the world, as you know it now, would be completely upside down. So in fact, the core of the system, the advanced economies, and then you have sort of semi-periphery and peripheral countries, but basically everybody would want to be in the periphery instead of the core, because it would be impossible to live in the core, because you're not going to be living a human life. So actually you have a reversal of what is going on right now. If you look at it futuristically, I think that we were looking at a very bizarre scenario.
So perhaps, before I move to more questions, I realize we have a lot of time, so we're just going to take it easy and speak as much as we want. Because then there is, to me, also another layer there in this discussion that is precisely in a way a center-periphery dynamic there, in the sense that, again, for example, going back to the issue was mentioned before, so Russia has deconducted other networks, and China has its own networks, and they are basically quite protectionistic against social networks, and that in the kind of liberal press in the West is usually presented as an example of totalitarianism, right? These countries don't want to have democracy. But then if you look at it from another perspective, actually these countries don't want to be basically have their economy completely controlled by companies that are all headquarters in the same country, namely the US. And therefore there is also a question for various countries that are not the US, right, including Britain, of why you should basically, for which reason you should accept these companies, say Google and Amazon, operating as they are, without basically paying taxes, evading taxation, while at the same time destroying your own companies, right? For example, the latest victim in the case of the UK economy is Maitland, the electronic company. So you have a UK company that is paying taxes, contrary to Amazon, that is headquartered in Britain, that has management in Britain, that has offices in Britain, that has employees in Britain, that has shops, right? So a company that is contributing to the local economy. And then basically you allow a foreign company, Amazon, headquartered in the US, that is paying a ridiculously small amount of taxes to come there into your economy and destroy your company. So that is also a kind of key question that I think now people are coming to realize that in a way there's been a sort of acceptance of this model as something inevitable, right? But with very serious consequences for basically for all the other countries, excluding the US, because I think also Britain, though being a kind of digitally savvy economy, is anyway losing out from this monopolistic situation that is also a sort of national monopolistic situation, namely one nation controlling the global digital economy. Perhaps a quick reaction to that, if you wish, and then we move to more questions. More questions. Okay. All right. More questions.
I have a question for both of you. And one of them, for Athina especially, relates to that phrase belong anywhere, which Airbnb uses as its official slogan now. But I've noticed that it's also been used in the way that they have advertised their workplace design. So there's a really interesting correlation between the way that slogan has not only worked to address their customers or their users, but in the way that they've built out the workplaces for their call center workers. They use it to describe the fact that they don't have a desk. And they actually get a touchdown desk when they arrive at the office, but they're encouraged to circulate around the building during the course of the day so that they can, change up their energy levels and be more comfortable and work longer hours, I'm assuming. But the thing that I find fascinating about Belong Anywhere is that it has this, as you explained so well, this kind of openness in terms of its meaning, because it can be used in multiple directions. And the thing that's concerning is that it sort of allows a privileged elite to traverse the world with ease in a very traditional colonial way. So I'd really like to know your comments on that. And then, Nick, it's such a pleasure to hear you speak in person. I'm a big fan. I wanted to push you a little bit on the AI situation as it's currently unfolding, partly because, at least inside the tech industry, it doesn't feel as victorious as you're painting it, and maybe that's reassuring for you to know in the first place. There are certain kinds of roadblocks that maybe were a little underplayed in what you were talking about, just in terms of standards and protocols and how things talk to each other and then how things get regulated, and that's certainly something I'm trying to learn more about while I'm here. That a lot of the companies are concerned that Europe does have better regulation powers and will be arresting some of the onward advance. But I also wanted to ask you for a bit more of a radical answer than you gave us, in the sense that you mentioned universities can't compete to retain talent in the face of this onslaught with the big companies having the salary metrics that they do. But I wonder if AI is the new Cold War in terms of, that's sort of how I felt at the end of all this, that AI is the new battle between the colonial powers globally. Will there be new institutions, new scientific institutions like NASA that come out of this that may actually prepare and resuscitate some of the functions of academia and engineering for the good?
Yes, you can get it. You can respond. We have a lot of time, so.
Yes, I think about the workplace, because I know you're place is also everywhere. So you have all sorts of relationships. There are no boundaries of where they are at all. So there's this breakdown where everything related to your work or your pleasure or your leisure is it can be anywhere at any point. It has to do with some of these sort of. I think when I listened to Nick, I thought a lot about the stack, the software and sovereignty, the Benjamin Bratton book, and I think it is wonderful how he describes some of the. I mean, if you are brave enough to go through the whole book, that is, so how he describes that what we thought was going to be decentralization is actually centralization. So the world is actually going some kind of bizarre reversal, and my hopes actually were more that the more you have diffusion, I was optimistic that you have the opening of identities, more fluidity. This belonging of everywhere would actually mean less fixed, closed identities of reactive desire, polarization, and so on, and what you see. And I thought that would be just the short term, and then long term you would see something else, and you don't see it. And I think it might be this selling your soul situation and how this is okay as long as and I think this individualized thing where you feel no solidarity. I mean, some research we did recently, we found out that people, okay, you don't care about your own privacy, for instance, but you don't care about anybody else's either. So you have this individualized situation, and in that sense, the Airbnb scenario or the Uber get a lot of people on it. All these scenarios are capitalizing on the fact that you can be happily alienated, and it's fine. People are not gonna. You see, and this is all ingrained throughout all institutions and apparatus around you. People don't mind; they're happy to be happily alienated. That's it. So that's what my response to you is. Unfortunately, this is where we are.
Yeah, really good points. I think you're right that it is still quite open, but it still seems to be dominated by the largest companies. You see competition between, Facebook's sort of AI framework and Google TensorFlow and Amazon's approach to it and Microsoft's approach to it. But they're all, massive companies, and they're all sort of competing against each other. So I do think there is still some openness about who's going to win this battle, but I'm very skeptical that any sort of startup is going to have any chance against these companies. Not least because if they stand a chance, they'll just be bought by those companies. So I think there's a lot of problems for trying to sort of lessen their power. I think the idea of NASA, the comparison with NASA, is really, really good. I've sort of had this idea of one of the great things about NASA and one of the great things about somebody like Mariana Mazzucato's work on the state investment in technologies is having these ideas about moonshot projects. And the moon was something which, seemed impossible, not any sort of short-term capitalist gain to be had from it, but it was an incredible project which mobilized a huge amount of resources and did something fantastic. Why can't we do something like that for AI? And have an institution which is devoted to that. I think that's a great idea. And two things which I think are really interesting in that regard, well, three things actually. One is an AI devoted towards macroeconomic planning. So sort of building up proper socialist ideas of using computers to run the economy. Sounds great. Another one would be energy management. So how do we manage to massive national grid, global grids, how do we manage energy more efficiently? And then the last one is something which I don't think people quite recognize as how difficult it is household robots. So household robots, the reason why we don't have sort of Jetson scenario of a made robot is because it's incredibly difficult to do technically. So we have a Roomba, but even like folding clothes is an incredibly complicated task for robots to do. Now what's really interesting is there's an OpenAI Institute, which is a sort of non-profit devoted towards opening access towards AI, and one of their core projects that they have is actually a household robot. And I think it's in part because this is a moonshot project to actually build a Jetson sort of maid-like scenario. They're incredibly difficult, and it would take a huge amount of resources to properly do it, but would also be a huge benefit to people if we ever made that technology.
owning that data. I simply want to know what is it done to that data and how the value is derived from it. If I can understand that, then if more people can understand it, then I guess there will be more startups, because people will know what to do with data, and those companies will have their monopoly will be undermined.
More? There was Nate there.
Okay, so a question for both speakers. In recent years, we've seen the rise of worker organizing within the tech industry. So most notably through the Tech Workers Coalition, where you have software engineers and product managers saying that they want to organize in solidarity with their colleagues, maybe cleaners, security staff who are lower paid, and to organize against, I guess, the ethical problems with the industry. So I was wondering for both of you, what sort of potential do you see in that sort of organizing and mitigating the worst successes of the industry, and what sort of challenges are you going to face?
And the last one. Nate, you were raising your hand.
Hello, Nate Cat, University of Warwick. Well, Mel, you'll be happy to know that here in the UK we have the Alan Turing Institute, which is doing research into AI. So we've got that base covered, and of course the industrial strategy that the government recently put out has AI and the data economy as one of its grand challenges. So the UK, of course, is in the world leading position as always. I'll leave the question of the singularity or the robot-made, unfortunate gendered robot aside. But I wanted to ask you, Nick, again to kind of push a little bit more on AI. You described it a few times as a general purpose technology, and it kind of stuck with me, because usually when people talk about general purpose technology, it's the computer as the kind of primary example. Of course, you can think about tools as having a number of purposes, like a hammer. You can use it in many different ways. And of course, there's also the saying about anything's a nail when you've got a hammer. Of course, I'm sure you know a lot about AI, and there's many different types within machine learning. A lot of early techniques were about like basically image recognition, very, very specific types of things. Go is another specific kind of machine learning. I just wondered why you talk about it as general purpose, whether or not that is the most productive way of thinking about it, and kind of what's at stake, because I saw from your images you kind of want to present it as this one thing, and I just kind of wondered why you wanted to do that instead of kind of I guess diversifying or thinking about the specificity.
Yes, so perhaps we just wait for the other questions, otherwise they become too much. We'll have the next round. Yeah, so it's 3 questions at the moment. So value, new forms of unionism, and AI for general purpose or not.
So what about the tech workers? So there are examples of unions and online and discussions online, and people exchanging stories in very many countries actually, as well, like places, people moderating, for instance, for Western companies in developing countries, sorry for the expression, ODA countries, in the periphery or whatever. So this actually happens. I think the worry is that it happens in a way the workers, the skilled workers of the world are not united, so to speak. So you have it in specialist sites. There are, I'm aware, organizations that specialize now, but the mainstream unions, they're not covering. And we've seen examples, for instance, with Deliveroo, and so they're not able to address the concerns of people in crowd work, gig work, and so on, to my understanding. Now that might change as things evolve, and there are models take care of organizing that respect. And then I was interested in what you were asking actually, if I may, about the value. What does it mean to know how to get value? In what ways would that necessarily? It would be great for you as an entrepreneur to know that, but how does it transform the world? If you see what I mean. What we know, like knowing how to get these externalities, all this to understand what this certain value is that is going to come and who can benefit from it. I think what it's going to feed into is this zombie capitalism. It's going to be continuing. So then you have understanding this value is going to mean that then no longer the leader is making money, so it's going to go to another thing, and then it's going to be a big crisis, and the more AI money is going to be made, for example, the bigger the crisis is going to be. So actually you have a bigger crisis than one which has had, like a bigger economic crisis, social crisis, and so on, than which has had, because of the sort of zombie capitalism scenario in a way, right? So I'm not sure that I want people to understand the value of AI. Yeah, and then there was your question that I'm going to leave for Nick to answer.
Yeah, so the value question. I think it is a really good question. I think when you see discussions of the value of AI or the value of data, it's really nebulous what's meant by value there. And I've always been sort of annoyed by the imprecision of that term. Particularly when we start talking about the distribution of value and where it's actually originating from, how it's getting distributed throughout the entire process. I think it's a really good question. I don't have an easy answer to it, but my sense is that most of the value that is being produced, whatever we mean by value, is going towards the AI provider at the present moment. In part because I think there's a political dependency there, an economic dependency, which allows them to have more power and therefore charge higher costs. That's sort of one of the things I think is really significant for companies that can't get access to AI, can't even build up their own sort of native source of it. So they have to have that relationship of dependency. Not a full answer to your question, but I think it's a really good question. On worker organizing, I think I'm always skeptical of the power of workers nowadays, particularly against massive companies. But I do think there's one really good sort of key test at the moment right now, which is Google and the military. So Google, it turned out, was helping the military with some drone stuff, and Google employees are quite outraged by it. It's unclear to me whether Google is going to step back from military procurement or not. I kind of don't think they will. I don't think workers have that much power, unfortunately. And then on the general purpose technology thing. So very briefly, I just mentioned in the economic sense that it's a technology which doesn't just apply to one sector, but is used across the entire economy. And it transforms every single sector. So the computer is here, an obvious example, but steam engine, things like that are classic examples as well. And AI is one thing. You're absolutely right. It's a sort of discursive shorthand that I just talk about AI as a singular thing. But of course, AI, there's numerous ways to do it. I saw a chart of a number of different neural nets that are in operation today. There's about 25 different neural nets that are popularly used. And of course, that's just one way of doing AI. There's other ways of doing AI that have nothing to do with neural nets. So if I transform this into a book, which I would like to at some point, I'll start pulling apart all the different types of AIs that are involved. Just for casual shorthand, I just say AI.
Right. Last round of questions.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. So part of this question has already been answered, so I'm just going to get on with that. Again, the question of so going back to the last question on capitalism and how concentration of wealth as opposed to capital happens, if you think about thinking in those terms. And the question whether, as part of these questions been asked before in terms of how what AI is and how it is different from, say, mobile computer technology that came before, and whether that technology, I mean, you give the answer, is it going to, it's going to concentrate, and it will concentrate, and I'm pretty sure it will. I mean, that's what the indication that you gave, and I think it's pretty accurate in the larger scheme of things. But the idea that you yourself showed in terms of the talent moving to certain places. Like right now, I mean, if you think from the Western perspective, it was Silicon Valley, and you said it's happening in China as well, but there was a lot of like, just cheap labor coming in from other places like India, moving to the Silicon Valley and the rest of it. And I think that the Scandinavian countries have a different model also in terms of their education systems and what UK is doing right now. But I'm saying is it's not, yes, talent is going to be super specialized at certain levels, but AI is it's not just super specialization in that sense. It's going to be, if it's going to be all pervasive, it's also going to be the in that sense whether they can be modeled within that model of monopoly capital, of how repurposing can happen, or of course the political economy of it works. I mean, Indian brain drain has been happening since the 1980s. I mean, they've been producing cheap engineers, but it's also because of the pervasiveness of technology that already existed in non-government places of whatever. And you need that. I mean, Google and Facebook did not have AI. I mean, they had been putting aside large amounts of capital for the past 15 years. It is, they were already socializing their profits into producing AI, and it's always going to work like that. And there will be mergers and acquisitions, and there will be excess capacity with people innovating from it. I'm not saying it's a brilliant picture out there, but I think Athina's presentation, therefore, is part of the answer. I mean, although your answers have been kind of, thinking about where it closes again, but the idea that yes, they're not politically driven, they're not socialist driven, particularly maybe at that sense quite frankly. In that sense, there are different ways to think about it. I mean, just one response.
Hello, both the presentations were really insightful, but my question is also to make in terms of the use of general purpose technology that you got me thinking too. Because somehow I feel like, is it really general purpose, or it's like creating a purpose, more like, because somehow I also feel there's so much of chaos and confusion. Like if you look at, we go back to Marx's idea of use value, probably we need to go back to that, because I think a lot of the value is actually created around like change and what we actually see as necessary in the coming times. So just not to make it so deterministic in some sense.
Thank you all so much for your talks. I'm Carol, and I'm from the University of Oxford, and I'm based at the Oxford Human Rights Hub. So my question is legal in nature. I'm wondering to what extent, when we ask the question, what do we do about big data or digital giants, this is an issue about the legal systems and the legal frameworks that we're using to address them. And I'm particularly interested in whether this is something that you've thought about or considered in relation to rights. Traditionally, states are the protectors and guarantors of rights. And so historically, human rights are the purview of governments, state governments. However, in 2011, the UN unanimously adopted the guiding principles on business and human rights. And so there's now this question about whether corporations should be responsible for human rights, and that means in the contemporary environment that they are not just responsible for not infringing on rights, but they may also be responsible for sort of positively providing rights to people. And so I'm wondering to what extent maybe changing the way that we think about these legal regimes might be an option for bringing people actually more into this conversation about technology and business and technology and corporate power, and whether using a human rights framework, and human rights of course are legally binding instruments, guiding principles are not, but human rights are. So I'm just wondering to what extent this may be helpful to go beyond things like antitrust policies and domestic antitrust laws in terms of dealing with these kinds of very large transnational corporations that operate on the scale of states in many ways. Thanks.
The last question.
Very briefly. Looking at the kind of platform economy, and hopefully it kind of asks both of the speakers, is obviously when you follow the money and when companies like
So you said that it was 2011, was it? Right? So that's very interesting to me because in 2010, I don't know if other people recall this, there was the Google China thing, right? So Hillary Clinton were basically, for those that might not be aware, you had Google accusing the Chinese of breaking into Gmail human rights accounts, activist accounts, and also intellectual property theft. And at that point, Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, and she said basically that it is the job of businesses to promote human rights around the world. Right? So it was the first time I think I've heard anything like that. And then the second to that, so I'm just tracking what it made me think and why I think it's problematic. Was during the Arab Spring, Obama was
Your attention, please. Your attention, please. You are required to leave the building immediately. Leave by the nearest exit. Do not run. Leave now.
Jesus, I've never heard that alarm before, but just for what it's worth. I thought that was a very overbearing club of drinks. Never heard that alarm before.
Your attention, please. Your attention, please. You are required to leave the building immediately. Leave by the nearest exit. Do not run. Leave now.
Quem gosta?